everyone. Welcome and thank you again so much for joining us for today's webinar titled Safe Banking, What's Next? I'm Michelle Rutter and I'm coming at you live from our national Washington, D.C. office here. And I'm so thrilled to be joined today by Andrew Klein, NCIA's Director of Public Policy, who's based out of our Denver office. We're both so happy to be here to talk to you guys a little bit about SAFE, how far we've come, what happened last week, what's next, and also hear a little bit about what those next steps are for both SAFE and beyond, and what our policy council is up to. So with that, I'll just go ahead and jump right in and get started. But one quick note, I do want to point out to all of you on the bottom of your screen, you should see an option to hit chat. So we encourage you as we're going through this webinar, if you have any questions, go ahead and use that chat feature and type them right in right there. And at the end, we'll have some time to take your questions. So please do utilize that feature. So I want to go ahead and get us started and kick off by talking about the beginning of SAFE. I want to see where we started and how far we've come in the last 6 years. And so legislation to provide safe harbor for financial institutions that choose to service the cannabis industry were introduced for the first time actually in 2013. And I apologize. Seems like a couple of my slides are out of order here or something, but that's okay. We'll roll with the punches. So legislation to provide safe harbor for financial institutions was first introduced in 2013. And back then, the bill was called the Marijuana Businesses Access to Banking Act. And when that bill died in that Congress back in 2014, it had 32 House co-sponsors and no Senate companion. And so the bill was then reintroduced in 2015 under the same name. And when that bill died in that Congress, it only had 39 co-sponsors. So from the first time it was introduced, it died with 32 co-sponsors. The second time it died with 39 co-sponsors. So you can see there was a little bit of an uptick in who was sponsoring, but it was still relatively low. In 2015, that was also the first time that the Senate decided to introduce a companion bill. And when that ended the session, it ended with 11 co-sponsors. So then in 2017, the bill was reintroduced and it was renamed, however, by yours truly, the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act, or what's now been called as the Safe Banking Act. And so when that bill ended last session, it had 95 co-sponsors and the Senate bill had 20. And so again, you're seeing then from 2013 to 2017, a huge difference. When it died at the beginning, it only had 32 co-sponsors, and in just in 4 short years that had tripled nearly to 95. And you can also see the Senate bill died then with 20 co-sponsors. And it's really important to note that the congressional champions who have been pushing this issue have been champions on this issue for a long time. They aren't new to this issue at all. In the House, we have Congressman Ed Perlmutter from Colorado and Denny Heck are the main 2 sponsors, and they have been the 2 main sponsors of this bill since 2013, since it was first originally introduced. In the House this session, it also had Congressman Steve Stivers and Warren Davidson. Both of them are Republicans from Ohio, who were really, really integral in maintaining that this was a bipartisan bill and that we have the best possible chances moving forward. And then in the Senate, this bill has always been introduced by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, and for the last 2 sessions, I believe, Senator Cory Gardner. And so I just think it's really important to note that we honor some of those congressmen who have been with us over this long journey over the last 6 years. So I talked a little bit about where we were, and now let's talk about where we are. So then the Safe Banking Act was reintroduced this session in the beginning of 2019. And when the bill was first dropped this year, it was introduced with 106 co-sponsors, including 10 Republicans. So I'm not the best at math, but that's about a quarter of the entire House of Representatives. And in the Senate, it was introduced with 21 co-sponsors, which is about a fifth of the Senate. So again, you're really, really seeing how far we've come in just a few short years. And a big reason for that, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think one of the most important reasons is because of the broad coalition that we were able to work with on this issue. We at NCIA have always been talking about banking since our inception. I've worked for the association for about 5 years now, and this has always been priority number one when we've been talking to offices, was to make sure our members have access to financial services, because we know that can be the difference between life and death in this industry or any other one. But what really hit a tipping point this year is that we were able to create a broad coalition of people to come together with us on this. In the past, we had met with groups like the American Bankers Association, and we would ask them, do you hear about this issue? What do your members think? And for many years, we were told, unfortunately, this is more of a regional issue, right? This is something we're hearing about more from our banks on the West Coast or from banks from just a few states. And they also reached a tipping point within the last year or two to realize that this was something that many of their members were asking for. And so you can see here, I know it's a little bit small. I had to make the font small in order to fit everybody on here. But the coalition that helped pass this was not only groups that are in cannabis reform or broader drug reform even, it's land title associations, it's bankers associations, credit union associations, unions. It enjoyed really, really broad support, and that was absolutely crucial in putting us to a point where offices were hearing about this, not just from people who they knew they would hear about it from, but they had insurance lobbyists coming in and real estate lobbyists coming in and banking lobbyists coming in. And so I really can't overestimate the importance of ensuring a broad coalition. And I think that's something that I'm sure all of you see back home at the state level as well. And so just a refresher, I know we talked a little bit about the history of the Safe Banking Act, but let's just do a quick reminder on what it is. And I'll let you guys read the slides here, but simply the Safe Banking Act seeks to harmonize federal and state law by prohibiting federal banking regulators from doing a number of different things. And so we will be the first ones to admit that the Safe Banking Act is only one small incremental step in the right direction. We still have so much work to do, and we'll get to that. We have a lot of work to do with this bill in the Senate, and we have a lot of work to do in cannabis reform generally, right? We still haven't descheduled this plant. We haven't created an industry that is equitable enough and diverse enough that as we would like it. And so this was only the first step for us. But that being said, that the Safe Banking Act provides safe harbor for banks that choose to service the cannabis industry. So it essentially says that you can't go in and punish a bank solely because they have decided to give a checking account to an ancillary business or a direct-to-plant business as well. And so the Safe Banking Act covers a number of things. Again, you can see some of them are as simple as providing or extending credit and servicing loans. I mean, you all know better than most that this can just include having a simple checking account. And something that I've found really important to tell legislators lately is not only that it's the inability to get a bank account or that you might lose your bank account, but also about the exorbitant fees that some of these businesses are facing. We are made up of nearly 2,000 member businesses, and most of those are small and medium-sized mom and pop businesses. And the fees for a checking account can be the difference between life and death. I was just talking with somebody last week, right after the bill passed, who told me that they operate a dispensary and their monthly fees just to have a checking account were about between $10,000 and $12,000 a month. And that is just something that's not good for small business, and it's not good for the banks either to be in this situation. So really, really critical that we get this piece of legislation passed. And so before we get to what happened with SAFE last week and what's next, I want to switch gears a little bit and mention that while we didn't have a vote on a marijuana banking bill before last week, and I think that that's important to mention as well, that this was the first time in history that a standalone marijuana bill was ever voted on. Some of you may know, and you see it here on your screen, in appropriations. We have had appropriations votes in the House before, both on things like medical marijuana and adult use marijuana, as well as banking. And so you guys will remember the appropriations process is the process by which the government funds itself every year. The government has to come up with a budget in order to keep it open and keep it operating. And so back in 2014, there was a House floor vote on a banking appropriations amendment, and that amendment was aimed at preventing the Treasury Department from penalizing banks that service cannabis businesses. And so that measure did make it to the floor for a full House vote, and you can see here, as I wrote, that it passed by a vote of 231 to 192, and that was really, really helpful. But the problem with that, as you guys can imagine, is that it was 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, not only has public opinion shifted greatly on this issue, but we've also had quite a number of states come online, whether that be CBD only, whether that's medical states or adult use states. And so the lay of the land is really different today, not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of who's in Congress. You know, we have a completely different Congress than we did back in 2014. Lots of new members, notably as well. So it was a little bit difficult to get a read on where we would fall on this, though we knew that through our whip counts and through talking with offices for months and frankly years about this, we knew that we had the majority support because we have 206 co-sponsors on the bill. But again, we were a little unsure about how a full floor vote would go. And so I wanted to just mention this appropriations piece because I'm going to talk a little bit about people flipping their votes. And thanks to our friends over at Marijuana Moment, I'm sure many of you follow that website and get their newsletter. And I would recommend you do. If you don't, it's a great place to get news. But they just put out a great piece today that's really taking a deep dive into the Safe Banking Act and what happened and looking at the numbers. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about people flipping their votes. And I want to just be clear that we're not talking about flipping their votes on the Safe Banking Act, because again, the first and only time that's ever been voted on was last week. So when we talk about that, we are going to be talking about switching their vote from this appropriations vote back in 2014 to the vote that we had last week on Safe. So getting Safe to the finish line, what happened last week? So back in February, the Safe Banking Act had a hearing in the House Financial Services Committee. A congressional hearing is just the way that members get together to talk about the bill, gather information. They invite witnesses to come and testify. The majority typically gets about 3 or 4. So in this case, that was the Democrats. The minority gets 1. And then the members of the committee are allowed to ask those witnesses questions so that they can use their expertise to learn more about the bill and about the issue itself. So we had that hearing back in February, and then following the hearing at the end of March, I believe it was, there was a markup by the House Financial Services Committee. And a markup is when amendments are offered to a bill and changes are debated, and then the committee at the end of it decides if they want to pass the bill out of committee or not. And so the House Financial Services Committee is one of the biggest ones. It has about 60 members. But we were very, very happy that after having some great debate and including amendments at the markup that included things like insurance, included things like GAO studies on equity and diversity in the industry, that bill, the Safe Banking Act, did pass out of committee by a vote of 45 to 15 and picked up quite a number of Republicans. And then finally, over the summer, longtime cannabis opponent, and Senate Banking Committee Chairman Mike Crapo held a hearing. And this was really, really notable because there are only 3 states now that don't have any sort of cannabis laws on the books. And Idaho is one of them, of course. And so the Senate Banking Committee Chairman, or any committee chairman or woman for that matter, has the ability to determine what bills they want to bring up for a hearing or a markup, or what bills they don't want to bring up for a hearing or a markup. And we had every indication for a long time that this was something that Senator Crapo was not interested in, not going to bring up. However, thanks to that wonderful broad coalition that I mentioned earlier, Senator Crapo felt a lot of pressure from the bankers. And so he did end up holding that hearing. And it was a really, really interesting hearing. And it left us with a lot of work to do in terms of educating members. Unfortunately, only I think Senator Crapo was the only Republican to actually attend the hearing, but monumental nonetheless that he held that hearing. And so last week, we made history in DC. The Safe Banking Act became the first standalone cannabis bill ever to be voted on, as I mentioned, and we passed the bill out of the House by a vote of 321 to 103. It's important to note here as well, this bill came up under suspension, which is a parliamentarian term. And what it means is that bills that come up under suspension are typically reserved for things that are non-controversial. And so they require, as a result, a majority, a 2/3 majority to pass them. And so because of that, we needed 290 yes votes in order to pass this bill instead of the usual simple majority. And so you can see by that number, we blew right by the 290 and ended up with 321. And we here in the DC office, we all took bets, and a couple of us came really, really close. No one hit 321 right on the mark. I think we had someone who had, a couple people who had 320, but a really, really monumental success. And we'll obviously get to this and talk about this in a moment about what this means for the Senate. But our goal had always been to break 300, and that was before we knew that we were going to bring the vote up under suspension. And so, but the goal had always been to hit that 300 number, because we believed that at that point it would become almost that the Senate couldn't argue with it at that point, that how can you ignore a bill that has gotten over 300 yes votes in the House? It becomes a lot harder not to bring it up and pay it no mind when it gets to the Senate. So we were really, really happy with the outcome and the numbers that we got there. And it's important to note that every single Democrat present on the floor, except for one, voted in favor. That one who voted no was Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama. And in addition to that, nearly half of Republicans in the caucus voted in favor, so 91 Republicans voted with us. So really, really, really strong bipartisan showing. And here I just want to show you some infographics I snatched from our friends over at GovTrack and Politico. I'll give them credit here. And of course, all of this will be available after the fact and will be sent to you all, so you'll have this yourselves. But just thought this was really, really interesting way to show you all who is voting in favor and who is not. So according to our friends at Marijuana Moment, again, all told, there were 44 members who voted differently this year as compared to in 2014 when we were talking about that appropriations votes, including 37 who flipped from no to yes and 2 who went in the other direction. 2 lawmakers who voted yes on the banking amendment but no on SAFE, who were Democrats, were Congressman Elijah Cummings and Jim Clyburn. And then you can see as well a couple other people swap their votes, the other way. I do want to note too, there's a number of interesting, it's always interesting to look at the roll call and see how people voted after the fact and where they came down. And I thought it was really, really interesting to see that Congressman Ken Buck from Colorado, as well as Congressman Doug Lamborn, also from Colorado, both voted no on this bill last week. So that was really sad to watch them not stand up for their constituents. But you guys can find that roll call. We can make sure that goes around so that you can see how people voted. So, of course, now everyone's big question, what's next? And so what's next is we go on to the Senate. And so currently the bill has about a third of the Senate co-sponsoring it. We're up to 33 co-sponsors in the Senate right now. And the 2 biggest players in this are going to be, again, I mentioned Senate Banking Committee Chairman Mike Crapo and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, because really, at the end of the day, whether or not this receives a floor vote is up to Mitch McConnell. He controls the calendar. He says what comes up for a vote and what doesn't. And so without him, we will not get a vote. And so in order to give SAFE the best chance in the Senate, we made sure our vote count was really high. Again, talking about over that 300 threshold, and made sure that we added in amendments that would make it more palatable for that more conservative Senate. And so 2 of those were things like Operation Choke Point language that we included to make this bill more palatable to Republicans, as well as language that ensured that hemp and CBD businesses are also covered by the Safe Banking Act. And I really have to give credit where credit is due to Andrew, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, because it was Andrew who really flagged that hemp hemp was not clearly enough included, and we made sure that language was tightened up, and we worked with our friends in Congressman Perlmutter's office to make sure that that language made it in there so that Senator McConnell knew that we're trying to support the hemp industry that he loves so much in his state as well. And so Chairman Crapo has indicated that he has some provisions that he'd like to include in the cannabis banking bill, like more anti-money laundering measures for legacy cash. But he has said that he wants to move a bill on this issue by year end. It's unclear right now whether or not Chairman Crapo is working on his own marijuana banking bill, or if what he is thinking is just going to be added on as amendments. And so that is also on our list of what's next, is determining what exactly the chairman wants to move forward with. Obviously, we will be encouraging him to address any other problems he has by amendments and amending the Safe Banking Act. We definitely don't want him to introduce a separate bill, especially not after this bill just passed out of the House so resoundingly. But you can see here that just last week, Chairman Crapo was quoted as saying, "This is an issue in which I've seen strong support not only across the country from various banking institutions, even the small community banks in states that don't have the issue, but also colleagues on both sides of the aisle." He said, "I think there will be good support for it." And so I would encourage all of you, you can find how to contact your senators on our website. You can simply Google it, however you want to get there. But I would really, really encourage all of you to call your senators and ask that they support the bill, whether that be in co-sponsoring it or asking for it to come to the floor for a vote. But it's going to be more important now than ever for this to come to the floor and for them to hear from you. The Senate Banking Committee, it's a difficult makeup, to be honest with you. There are a lot of senators from southern states and states that don't have robust cannabis programs, if one at all, on the committee. And so it will be a challenge. But the fact that Chairman Crapo is already indicating that he's interested in this issue and wants to actually work within it is really, really exciting for us. And so we're very hopeful about the prospects in the Senate. So we're looking forward to working with Chairman Crapo to get a markup on the bill and advance it to the Senate floor. Again, I already mentioned that the hemp provisions that we helped include were critical in getting SAFE scheduled, hopefully. And so again, I encourage you to call your senators. And I also would encourage you guys to make sure that your membership is up to date. You know, this work is really, really important for us, but it was done as a result of members like you all who pay your dues and make sure that we can be here in DC fighting for you guys every day. Like I said, I've been doing this for 5 years, and every time I go to a Hill office, the first issue I talk about is banking. And so we really rely on your all support, and you can learn how to get more involved, whether that be through becoming a member, joining a committee, donating to the NCIA PAC. You can find out about all of that on our website, of course. And so one last thing I want to mention before I turn this over to Andrew, and I apologize, I don't have a slide for you all because this just happened over the weekend, but I do think it bears mentioning, is that we talked about appropriations earlier. And of course, the appropriations process is one that we go through every year to fund the government, as I mentioned. And the end of the fiscal year is actually today, September 30th. So typically the government has to pass their appropriations bills by today, September 30th, in order to keep the government open. If they can't do that, they enact what's called a continuing resolution, which you can kind of think of as a copy and paste of what was the budget from last year. And so Congress passed and the president signed a continuing resolution over the weekend that will continue to fund the government through November 21st. That CR did include what many of you know as the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment or the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment, or protections that apply to state medical cannabis programs and patients. And so that is included in that CR up until November 21st. But when debating the appropriations process for FY 2020, which will be next, the House included some amendments that pertain to banking. There's one included that is just the same as that one from 2014. Again, that would prohibit the Department of the Treasury to punish banks solely for working with cannabis-related businesses. So that made it into the House Appropriations bill, as did protections for all cannabis businesses, not just medical, but also adult use. And so both of those provisions, the adult use amendment and the banking amendment, made it into the House's versions of the appropriations amendments, but it is unclear about what their fate is in the Senate. Currently, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Shelby and Senator Patrick Leahy, the ranking member on the committee, have what is called a gentleman's agreement that's been in place now for a few years. And what that agreement basically means is that neither side will introduce an amendment or language that the other side would consider to be a poison pill. And that is just solely so that they can actually get this done and get it out the door without shutting the government down. Unfortunately, Congress is Congress, and despite this gentleman's agreement, the Senate still hasn't done their work, and so that's why we have the CR. But all of that is to say that it's going to come down to a conference committee about whether or not these amendments get included. We currently are talking with our friends on the Appropriations Committee about this, but our indications show that if either the banking or the adult use amendment were offered in committee, that they would either fail or be withdrawn. And so we don't want to make it look like these are not popular provisions or that they don't have support, but we've decided that the best avenue is probably going to be for senators and allies to battle this out in conference, which means after both the House and Senate pass their appropriations packages, then the bill goes to a conference committee to battle out what the difference is and what those, what's different between both the House and Senate versions. And so that is where we will be working to see if we can include this banking amendment in the appropriations bill or the adult use amendment in the appropriations bill. And so that'll all be unfolding between now and November. And so now that I've told you all about that, I want to turn it over to Andrew. And I'm so excited that he's here to talk to us today about some of the additional what's next, because, the question I get on the Hill all the time is what's next? Literally, we have all these bills and many of them about descheduling, and Hill offices always go, well, we deschedule. Well, then what's next? What does this industry look like, and how do we regulate it? And so Andrew and our policy council here have been doing some really, really terrific work that's helping us answer those questions. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Andrew to talk a little bit about what they've been up to.
Thanks, Michelle. Before I get into the policy council, I just want to pause for a minute on this vote. 321 to 103. There's not much bipartisan support for anything these days. And this is really remarkable. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Michelle, Maddie, and Mike have been working for the last 5 years on this bill. We're the only national organization with 3 full-time lobbyists in DC and a full-time policy director. So if you like the work that we're doing, I would encourage you to take a look at our website, support our work either by joining NCIA, donating to the PAC, or donating to NCIA to support the Policy Council's work. If you're interested in learning more about the Policy Council, you can take a look at our website. There's a 4-page description of what we've built. But in summary, we are the think tank of cannabis. We are producing substantive white papers on issues of import to the industry. So in the past, and all these papers can be found on our website, we produced papers on 280E, social equity, FDA rulemaking, and probably 24 other important topics. In order to join the Policy Council, you have to be a sustaining member of NCIA and then donate either $5,000 to the PAC or $5,000 to the Policy Council to support our work. Right now, we've got about 29 entrepreneurs, general counsels of companies, FDA lawyers, and others, influencers in the industry. And we're working on a number of papers, including interstate commerce. Right now, we've got states that are producing larger quantities of marijuana that they can actually sell within their state, and they'd like to be able to sell it to other states. We're working on an environmental sustainability paper. There's a lot of waste in the industry, a lot of wasted electricity, wasted water, double packaging. And so we're taking a hard look at how we might be leaders in the environmental sustainability realm. And most importantly, tomorrow, we're going to be releasing a paper on how we believe cannabis should be regulated at the federal level once descheduling happens. And as Michelle alluded to, we at NCIA have supported all these incremental approaches. So we've supported safe banking, we've supported the States Act. We continue to do so, but we do believe that only descheduling and a federal regulatory framework will ultimately suffice to propel the industry forward. So as I said, tomorrow we're going to be introducing a paper called Adapting a Proven Regulatory Framework for the Emerging Cannabis Industry. There'll be an article in Politico tomorrow summarizing our paper, and we'll be emailing out links to our members and anyone else who's on our database so you can read it. I think we're at about 43 pages. So I would encourage you to take a look tomorrow when the paper comes out, but I'm going to give you a little bit of preview now. First of all, what we decided to do was not reinvent the wheel. So rather than suggesting that we create some new government bureaucracy, we looked at existing agencies and said, how can we fit cannabis regulation into work that's already being done? And so we took a hard look at the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which is a part of HHS, and a little office called the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB, which currently regulates alcohol, and that's a division of the Treasury Department. Our paper starts with descheduling. As you probably know, currently marijuana is a Schedule I drug, and there are 5 schedules. In order to be a Schedule I drug, the drug has to have a high potential for abuse and have no medicinal value. In terms of the high potential for abuse, there's just no consensus in the scientific community to support the notion that marijuana is addictive. And we all know that it's objectively safer than both tobacco and alcohol, which are not scheduled. And so we believe that marijuana is mischaracterized or misclassified as Schedule I. The other piece is that the government says there's no medicinal value. And that assertion is just fundamentally irreconcilable with reality. First of all, we have 33 states that have medicinal programs, number one. Number two, a little known fact, actually the federal government owns a patent for the medicinal use of marijuana. In the year 2003, the federal government applied for and obtained a federal patent, and the Department of Health and Human Services actually owns that patent for medicinal use of marijuana. And then lastly, we also know that GW Pharma and others have already gone through clinical trials and have approved pharmaceutical drugs with either CBD or marijuana, drugs like Marinol, that use either synthetic or plant-based marijuana to produce those drugs. And so the notion that there's no medicinal value is just completely false. And so we believe that the first thing we need to do is deschedule, not just take it out of Schedule I, but deschedule completely, not have marijuana contained in any of the 5 schedules that exist in federal law. Why is that? Well, first of all, we believe that marijuana should be regulated to protect the public health rather than as a criminal enforcement mechanism. So the first thing we want to do is take authority away from the DEA and provide it to the FDA and TTB, and provide them with clear regulatory authority to treat this as a public health issue as opposed to a criminal law issue. Doing that will immediately resolve the conflict that exists today between the state licensed cannabis programs and existing federal law, which criminalizes the use, manufacture, sale of marijuana. We believe that rescheduling, so some politicians have called for, as opposed to descheduling cannabis, taking it out of the schedule, some politicians have called for a rescheduling, so putting it in a different classification like 2 or 3. But we believe this is bad public policy for a variety of reasons. But the most important reason is that would retain the prescription drug model and would require basically everyone to get a prescription for cannabis. And it would also require the FDA to continue in their clinical trials and drug approval process, which historically has been quite expensive, upwards of $1 billion to get a drug approved, quite arduous and time consuming. But it also flies in the face of the very successful marijuana programs that have existed in the 33 states that have approved a medicinal program and the 11 states that have approved a recreational program. And it also continues this, retains this state-federal dichotomy, which just confuses people and is just bad public policy. Another reason to completely deschedule marijuana as opposed to reschedule is that it removes the barriers to research. So, right now we've had limited research, which has made it really difficult for people to obtain prescription drugs or patents. And so we want to make it easier for people to conduct research and provide safe medicine for folks. It also sets us on a path to fix social equity issues. So descheduling would streamline the process for expunging criminal records, which we all know is a very important, if not essential piece of the puzzle here. It also immediately fixes banking and 280E. It's great that we're on the path to fix banking, but right now there's no path to fix 280E. And as everyone in this call probably knows, small businesses are operating with an effective 80% tax rate due to arcane IRS provisions that don't allow small businesses to take business deductions because they're operating in violation of the Controlled Substances Act. Makes absolutely no sense. And lastly, descheduling would immediately facilitate interstate commerce, which we believe is important for those states that are producing quality product that could be sold to other states, notwithstanding the impediments that exist because of scheduling. So our paper calls for descheduling, and then it breaks it down into 4 lanes. And basically what we do is we create these 4 categories based on chemical compound, safety, intended use, and consumption methods. So the first lane, and I'll talk briefly about each of these in a minute. The first lane would be for pharmaceutical drugs. The second lane would be for ingested, inhaled, or topically applied products with more than de minimis amounts of THC. The third lane would be for ingested or inhaled products with de minimis amounts of THC. And the fourth lane would be for topically applied products with de minimis amounts of THC. So let me take each of these lanes and give you a little bit of a preview. I can't go too much in depth because we are releasing this paper tomorrow, so I would encourage you to take a look at the political article and get on our website and review the full paper tomorrow morning. Lane 1 includes all products approved as pharmaceutical drugs over which FDA currently exercises jurisdiction under the authority of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So essentially, we don't make any changes to the current pharmaceutical model with the exception of descheduling cannabis. So, drugs such as Epidiolex and Marinol, which have already been approved, continue on that path. And then in other companies, I read today that GW Pharma is looking at, so Epidiolex cures children's epilepsy, and now they're looking at curing autism with cannabis. And so they can still do that through the existing rigorous drug approval process. They can make substantiated disease claims with those prescription drugs, and FDA would have sole regulatory authority under that lane. Lane 2, which is the lane I think everyone's going to be paying attention to, is a lane that includes all edibles, inhalable products, and topically applied products that are not approved as pharmaceutical drugs in lane 1, but contain more than a de minimis amount of THC. As you probably know, in the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bill, Congress created this arbitrary dividing line and said, we have 0.3 THC as hemp-derived CBD, which became legal in the 2018 Farm Bill. But if CBD or any other cannabinoid is derived from the marijuana plant, it remains scheduled in the illegal. We believe that's bad public policy. People should be able to choose whether they want to derive their CBD or CBN or CBG from either hemp or marijuana. And if they derive it from marijuana, we believe that the product should be tested after the fact to make sure that we comply with that federal law, the .03, rather than testing it at the plant stage, which really makes no sense. And so we should open it up to marijuana, not just hemp. These products would be sold through state licensed retail stores to individuals meeting state age requirements and or qualifying medical conditions. So essentially, the state systems would be left alone. They would continue regulating at the retail level. The TTB, the Department of Treasury, and FDA would play roles here. The TTB would play the same role that they play in alcohol regulation today. There would be an MOU signed between FDA and TTB to essentially continue the relationship that they have with alcohol in cannabis. Of course, each agency would probably need some more money and some more FTEs or personnel to be able to do this. Legislation that would be required to make this happen would be descheduling, and then of course granting authority to TTB to regulate cannabis similar to alcohol, and legislation would be required to facilitate interstate commerce, just like we did in the Farm Bill for hemp. Lane 3 would be low THC consumables, so pills, capsules, tinctures. These products would be regulated by the FDA to protect the public health and ensure accurate labeling. Sales would be allowed anywhere where food and drug supplements are sold. These would be, again, products that test below 0.3, so they're non-intoxicating. Legislation that would be required would be legislation that I discussed a minute ago to fix that arbitrary dividing line that exists currently between hemp and marijuana. And then legislation to allow FDA to regulate inhalables, which doesn't currently exist in federal law. And then legislation to establish parameters to allow some limited claims by the companies that are producing these consumables under lane 3. And then lane 4 would be devoted to the low THC products that are topically applied. So these would be products that like massage oils or lotions that contain CBD that are not orally consumed. They would be sold with cosmetics and regulated similarly to cosmetics. And the FDA would regulate these products to protect the public health and make sure that labels are accurate. So again, I encourage you to take a look at the paper tomorrow, and I think we'll open it up for questions for the remaining few minutes that we have.
All right, so everyone, don't forget you can look at the bottom of your screen and you should see the ability to pop open a chat feature. So you can ask us some questions there. We have a couple here. So Andrew, we have one I think that would be good for you. So Jack asks, do you feel like the vote on the Safe Banking Act suggests that FDA will make some movement on expressly permitting cannabinoids as food ingredients and or supplements? So Andrew, I think I want to pose that one to you since you and the Policy Council did some great work with the FDA and their public comment period earlier this year. So what do you think?
I'm not sure that there's a direct correlation between the vote on safe banking and FDA's regulation of CBD, but I will say FDA is getting an inordinate amount of pressure from Congress and the public to move expeditiously. I know Mitch McConnell has been pressing them recently to get these regulations out the door. And particularly in light of the vaping illnesses, I think we're probably going to see FDA act a little bit sooner than we had originally anticipated. So I'm hoping that it will be in the next month or so.
Okay, here's another one kind of similar. Would it take a full descheduling of cannabis off of Schedule 1 for the FDA to support cannabis research at the federal level outside of the product grown at Ole Miss?
Not sure I understand the latter part of the question, but I do believe that it will take descheduling to fully promote research without restrictions, because any schedule, 1 through 5, will still require a prescription, which means clinical drug trials, which means early FDA involvement in order for research to happen, and that's been an impediment so far. So I don't see why anything would change if we were to reschedule. I really do firmly believe we need to deschedule.
Okay, we just got one in from Jimmy, and excuse me, I'm reading it as we come. He says, after the passage of safe banking, do you expect any other votes on cannabis bills this session, i.e. one of the many bills on cannabis at the VA or any others? Well, it's a little hard to say. We've had a lot of hearings on the issue. We've had hearings at the VA committee. We've had hearings in the Financial Services Committee. We've had hearings with the Small Business Committee. We've had a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and that's just at the House. So I do think that there will be votes on other cannabis bills. I know Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, just introduced within the last couple of months a bill that they have entitled the MORE Act, which would deschedule cannabis and has some of the most comprehensive equity and diversity requirements in it than any bill that we've ever seen. And he has stated that he wants that bill to come up for a vote. And so because he is the chairman of the committee, he gets to make that call. They already did the hearing right before it was introduced. So now it's just a matter of whether they'll have a markup and then a House floor vote. But I think there's a good chance that we see that bill come out for a vote. And Jimmy followed up and said, on the floor, will this action stay in committee? I think there will be a lot of action in committee still, but I do think we'll see some more floor action as well. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Someone asked, who was the dissenting Democrat and what is or was the reason for the nay vote? The dissenting Democrat was Congresswoman Terry Sewell from Alabama. I don't know that it's necessarily clear why she voted no. It was surprising for a number of reasons. We knew she isn't a big champion on this issue or a big fan necessarily, but when we had some of those appropriations votes, we had a number of them back in 2014 and 2015. And they ranged from issues from banking, like I talked about, to medical marijuana, to hemp, to CBD, and she actually voted yes in favor of all of those appropriations amendments. And so to see her vote no and be the sole no vote was pretty surprising. You can see that we, our allies, the Hill, all worked really, really hard to make sure that basically no Democrats voted no. I think that there were there was 5 Democrats who were like they didn't vote, they were absent. And so to have her really be the sole one on the record definitely put her in the spotlight. So I'm a little unclear as to why she decided to be the one, but I would assume at the end of the day, like many things, it came down to her constituents and some concerns that she was hearing. And then, okay, one more question, I guess. Andrew, I'll let you take this one, or you can ask if you don't want to, I can. Do you think impeachment will slow down the Senate supporting this passing? I think the impeachment will slow down everything.
Isn't that the elephant in the room?
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, the reality is that most of the work on impeachment, I think, is going to be done by House Intelligence, at least the investigation. And so, there will be a period of time when House Judiciary is going to have to take up impeachment. But my guess is that's going to be a pretty expedited process, and most of the hearings and most of the work will be done in the Intelligence Committee. So my guess is not really.
Yeah. But we'll continue to keep a close eye on it for all of you. And so we just want to thank all of you all for attending this webinar, for being NCIA members. Again, this work wouldn't be possible without you all. It's so important to have you guys behind us. And so thank you for joining us. We hope you have a great week, and we'll talk with all of you soon.